Welcome, folks. My name is Erin Lurie. I'm the Adult Audiences Manager at Hillwood. We are so pleased that you're joining us tonight for Jan Stewart's lecture. Zoom is in the process of admitting everyone into the program, so we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you all for joining us. We will get started shortly. All right, it looks like most everyone is in. Welcome again. At this point, I am going to turn us over to Kate Markert, who will introduce the program.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and it is always a pleasure to connect with our members. And I'm so glad that we are all joined tonight by groups from our friends at the Preservation Society of Newport and also the Freer Sackler. So welcome all to the final lecture in our Natural Beauties lecture series. The exhibition, which of course features exquisite works of minerals and gems, remains on view until January 3rd. So I do hope you will all come to see it. We're open Tuesday through Sunday, and more information about our hours, our cafe, all the COVID policies can be found on our website, hillwoodmuseum.org. And I'll also just mention that we're open just this Friday evening until 6:30. So that may be a good moment for you to come by Hillwood also, of course, weather permitting. So now I'd like to share a couple of quick reminders about Zoom. Even though your cameras and microphones are off, of course, we still want to hear from you. And we hope you will submit your questions through the Q&A module just whenever they cross your mind, and we will get to them at the end. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome Jan Stewart, the first Melvin R. Seiden Curator of Chinese Art at the Smithsonian's Museum of Asian Art. Jan works broadly in the area of Chinese art with a special focus on ceramics, decorative arts, textiles, and court arts, including paintings from the Song through the Qing Dynasty. She holds degrees from Princeton and Yale, specializing in Chinese art, language, and literature. Jan assumed her current role at the Freer Sackler in 2014 after creating new galleries at the British Museum for the Sir Percival David collection of Chinese ceramics and for Chinese paintings as the Keeper of Asia. She had previously been at the Freer Sackler and held a prestigious Mellon Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She, along with Daisy Wang, co-curated an exhibition and book entitled Empresses of China's Forbidden City, 1644 to 1912. That exhibition traveled to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem and then closed at the Freer Sackler in June of 2019. So please join me in welcoming Jan Stewart.
Well, thank you very much. I really thank Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens for the invitation to speak in this series that examines the intersections between art and nature, and in my case, between art and rocks, something that is at the heart of Chinese culture. I appreciate Director Kate Markert's warm welcome, and I also wish to thank Erin Lurie for her inspiration behind the talk and the seamless organization of it, as well as thanks to Edward Vreeland for technical guidance. Now here, what you're looking at in this title slide is a limestone boulder that's about the size of a small tree. And it represents one type of esteemed rock in China that I will talk about tonight. It's a rock from China's Lake Tai region, not far from Shanghai. and it is currently accessioned in the collection of the San Antonio Museum of Art in Texas, placed in their garden. So perhaps an idea for Hillwood Gardens to follow. Rocks as valued objects, rocks as art, my topic tonight, have a long multivalent history in China, about which I will offer some introductory comments to reveal a deep fascination with the lithic in Chinese culture. I am dividing Chinese admiration for stones into two distinct lineages: worked and polished stones, such as you see on the left, and natural or almost natural craggy stones as presented on the right. The two traditions are connected by a belief in the wondrous hidden cosmic power that is thought to be embodied in geological specimens. Now, the Chinese stones in the Hillwood Estate Museum, some on the screen now, belong to the category of worked and polished stones. But rather than focus on Hillwood's collection, which all belong into this type of worked stone and tend to date rather late, from 17th century or later, instead of concentrating on that, I want to tonight illustrate China's larger engagement with stones. I will devote equal attention to scholars' rock tradition of naturalistic stones because it is less well known in the States and yet fundamental to any full appreciation of Chinese art and its sources of creativity. The Chinese tradition of stones is distinct from what most of us who grew up in the Euro-American world identify with. If I asked you to choose one mineral specimen on the screen to take home for aesthetic contemplation and reverie, will it be the twisting and craggy rock on the left, the polished white jade in the middle, or the Hope Diamond? Your answer tells me how simpatico you are with traditional Chinese cultural values. A member of the educated Chinese milieu, whether we are talking about in the past or today, would undoubtedly choose the rock on the left, while also highly, almost equally appreciating the finely worked jade in the middle. But choosing the diamond is completely outside of traditional Chinese aesthetics. With only rare exceptions, sparkling gems have not been part of Chinese culture. While in contrast, for well over a millennium, in Persia, India, and Euro-America, gems, especially those that glitter with polyhedral faceting, are the most esteemed minerals. If you gravitated towards the Hope Diamond, I hope by the end of tonight you might change your mind and see greater allure in other types of stone. Here, coming back to the two rock traditions in China, let me point out that as early as Neolithic times, the Chinese were harvesting and working jade, which is a notably hard and durable stone, has an astonishing surface to touch, and comes in a broad, wide palette. The colors range from translucent to softly opaque, from white to whitish yellow to hues of brown and red brown and a rich variety of greens. The surface feels cool to the touch and unctuous or soft and slightly oily, which is rather extraordinary, don't you think, for a tough rock? The word jade, yu in Chinese, in particular refers to the favored mineral nephrite, an example of which you see on the left. However, traditionally, Chinese use the word jade broadly to include many types of hard rocks that can be polished and successfully carved, even including, for example, the rose quartz stone we saw a minute ago in the carved figure in the Hillwood collection. Now, on the other hand, Western mineralogists use jade as a term to refer to only two minerals, the nephrite that you see here, and also they use it for a translucent bright green or lavender mineral known as jadeite, which only came into China around the 18th century and which I'm not dealing with tonight. So when I talk about jade tonight, by and large, I'm focusing on nephrite. For those of you who are geologists, when I talk about the scholars' rock traditions, such as on the right, it is limestones, various types of limestone that have pride of place in that tradition. Now, focusing again on the jade here, the ancient Chinese showed exceptional technical prowess to carve nephrite because it is such a hard, tough mineral that it cannot be carved by a knife, but rather must be shaped by abrading or grinding away the unwanted portion of the stone. Very simply explained, finely ground minerals harder than jade, such as quartz, garnet, corundum, or diamond, are used as abrasives. And in combination with tools of wood, bamboo, stone, bone, and linen, as well as copper, iron, or steel, the jade is ground down and cut into its final form, and it's then polished. Now, the exact tools and methods of working jade changed over time, becoming ever more complicated and efficient. You wouldn't believe, but in that jade disc, that hole is ground away with this abrasive powder and a bamboo tool. It takes formidable skill and patience to work jade. The material was not chosen casually, but it must have had some deep meaning. Otherwise, an easier material to harvest and to work would surely have been chosen. We don't know the exact meaning of Neolithic jades to their makers because, of course, they predate writing. But we can surmise that the circular or the B discs with a pierced hole in the center that you're looking at here were important ritual objects. We find them basically placed in tombs, surrounding a corpse or beneath the foot of the corpse. This jade, which is in my museum, was deemed special enough by its makers to be embellished with an incised bird glyph. Meaning of that is unknown. Now, later burial customs around the beginning of the Common Era continued to emphasize using jade around a corpse. The most elite tombs of that time contained corpses encased in a bodysuit made of small pieces of jade sewn together with gold wire. Written records of the time make it clear what the meaning was. These suits were intended to protect and preserve the body and the soul, enabling the deceased to attain immortality. Archaeologists speculate that Neolithic Chinese were already viewing jade as a stone imbued with extraordinary protective power. Ancient reverence for jade remained a constant in Chinese culture, taking on new connotations and uses for the living, from the beginning of the Common Era and going on until today. We will circle back to jades later, but now I want to focus on the tradition of the unworked or ostensibly unworked stones, which hold as much value in the Chinese mind as jades, that we call scholar stones, as you see on the right. The tradition of scholars' rocks is centered on collecting, displaying, admiring, and even befriending these untouched natural geological specimens. In truth, I should say largely untouched, because hidden tool work in many cases was used to augment the piercing, pitting, and furrowing of a stone. But as long as a rock looked as if it were entirely shaped by natural forces, in the Chinese conception of scholars' rocks, it was fair game. Natural rocks were artfully displayed in Chinese gardens as early as the Han Dynasty, 3rd century BCE. And by about the 7th to 10th century, rocks for both indoor and outdoor display were actively sought after, collected, and esteemed for both spiritual resonance and aesthetic qualities. A desirable rock for indoors would be placed on a pedestal and positioned so that it could ignite the viewer's imagination, making him, and this was largely men, making him envision a journey through a mountain landscape, or feel that purified, immortal beings who dwell in mountains might come down and visit you in your home because of the vehicle of the rock. So these scholars' rocks were coveted every much as the carefully, painstakingly shaped and polished jades. The category of these rough rocks is called scholars' rocks because this was the group of educated elite in China who most actively collected and wrote about them. They developed the connoisseurial literature of what they should look like, what was highly regarded. We will see that emperors also collected scholars' rocks. But there are other names in China that I want you to keep in mind as well. These naturalistic rocks can be called spirit stones, a convenient translation of a common Chinese name for them called gongshi, which is a phrase that embodies connotations of deep respect, verging on religious veneration for the stones. They are also admiringly called strange stones, guaishi in Chinese literature. But I will call them scholars' rocks tonight. Just keep in mind the connotations of the other names. Also, while you're looking at this rock on the right, you notice that it is mounted on a wooden pedestal. Pedestals were developed early on for displaying scholars' rocks because when you place a rock on a pedestal, it separates it, it takes it apart from the mundane world and gives it authority. Transformed by its mounting, a rock becomes an art object. When it's removed from its stand, it converts back into a natural object. It is unusual to touch upon the two traditions of the work jades and the natural rocks in a single lecture. But I am doing so because the two share a deep-rooted commonality in a Chinese recognition of the power of stones to be fluid, dynamic, and constantly changing, capable of magical transformations and replete with auspicious and protective powers. It is helpful in understanding China to see what a broad range of lithic art there is. It is not that rocks have not mattered in other ancient societies. We can think of dolmens and tumuli or Stonehenge as an example of mystical connotations that stones in Western culture have been endowed with. But I am struck that Western traditions died out, while the Chinese attraction to jades, first used for burials, continued, albeit taking on new meanings. Here, I picture a Chinese grave that is roughly contemporary with Stonehenge. And we see the grave pit, which is in a region found near Shanghai, was filled with jade bee discs and also with tsung, which are jade tubes. They surrounded the corpse to protect the body and its soul. But whereas we don't see references to Stonehenge in later European culture, we do see the Chinese Neolithic passion for jade has been kept alive even into modern times. On the right, you see an image of a study that belonged to an 18th century emperor. And you can see that the Neolithic jade burial tube, what you see here, oh, excuse me for that. What you see here as a tube of jade has become, again, excuse me, sometimes PowerPoint doesn't communicate well. Just one second. You see these jade tubes here have been turned into a flower vase. This is a reinterpretation of a jade tube, but again, I want to make the point that this love for jades never died in China. Likewise, a love for raw rocks stayed steady in Chinese culture since about the 3rd century BCE, when they first appeared in gardens. Now, let me say, excuse me again. Let me say a brief word about Chinese gardens. And I'm afraid I have gone too far. When we look at Chinese gardens, most of the extant ones, as you see on the left, date from the 16th to 18th century and are found in the south, in the area around Shanghai. But similar gardens were everywhere throughout traditional times in China. Here, I want to draw your attention to the ancient pictogram that's shown on the right side of the screen that tells us what from the very beginning were considered the essential elements of a garden. What you have is a border around the outside of the character, which is representing a wall that separates the garden from the cacophony of the world around it. And inside, you see a series of brushstrokes that represent a tree. In the middle, what you have is a pond, water. And at the bottom, what you have is a diagram of a mountain. So gardens were always about water and mountains. And as you look on the left, you can see that garden mountains, they were artificially constructed by bringing many rocks into the garden and piling them together to represent mountains. Now, when we look at natural style rocks, they were collected and displayed in China and appreciated with a range of sizes, from those that are suitable for gardens, such as on the left, and they could drill down to the size that would fit comfortably in your hand, be much smaller even than an apple. Regardless of the size of a rock, all rocks in Chinese culture tie into philosophic and religious traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. All three of those philosophies imbue mountains, and by extension, their microcosmic representatives, rocks, with potent meanings. Writing attributed to the great philosopher and teacher Confucius, who died in the 5th century BCE, reads, "The wise delight in water, the humane delight in mountains." Taoist philosophers of the same period conceptualized mountains as paradises containing hidden worlds in which immortal, transcendent beings dwelled, coming in and out of their rocky homes through the caves that populate the mountains. So while looking at these rocks, let me recount the story of a great public servant and literary genius of the 8th, 9th century, Bai Zhu, whose writing was at the very beginning of an ever-growing tradition that illustrates how Chinese scholars formed a deep emotional bond with rocks. And by the way, the different sizes of the pictures on this slide are not entirely to scale, but they are meant to be suggestive of that range of sizes of the rocks that surrounded a Chinese scholar. In 826, Bai wrote a poem called Ode to Two Stones after he took a walk around Lake Tai, the area around Shanghai. And this is where the rock on the left and in the middle hail from. So on his stroll around the lake, he found two rocks that he found singular in form. He transported them home, scrubbed them clean, and wrote a poem describing them as disagreeable, even downright ugly, yellow, dark and deformed, moldy looking with cracks and imperfections. And he explained that this very appearance made the stones admirable witnesses to the natural processes and forces of the universe and nature, according to the principles of the Taoist philosophy. He went on to describe that he asked the rocks to keep him company in his old age. And although they were without speech, the rocks signaled their promise to eternally befriend him. Bai's Rhapsody tells us several things. Rocks were studied and appreciated for their appearance. Even ugly could be considered a positive attribute, as long as the appearance connected to the forces of nature's transformative powers. And we see that rocks were valued for their subliminal communication with the human soul. About 300 years later, there is a well-known story of a prominent scholar and calligrapher, Mi Fu, who stopped in front of a garden rock like the one on the left, and he bowed down to such a rock in reverence, calling it his elder brother. Western authors in the 20th century studying the Chinese passion for rocks, collecting and displaying them, have been stymied about how to describe the phenomenon, eventually coming up with words that are not found in the Oxford English Dictionary, inventing the terms petrophiles and petromania to draw attention to the obsessive fascination with stones that, if you don't mind my pun, was a bedrock of Chinese civilization. At the time that Baijiu was writing in the 9th century, scholars were beginning to develop a connoisseur's literature devoted to the abstract aesthetic properties of rocks, while never forgetting their emotional and mystic power. Qualities that you see in these rocks on the screen that were admired include twisting or thrusting shapes, rhythmic contrasts of solid and void, and richly textured surfaces that carry heaven-endowed cosmic patterns in their bubbles, bumps, pits, and wrinkles. Rocks were enjoyed by eye and hand. Here, the littlest rock on the right, which is about to become a gift to my museum, fits easily in the palm of a hand, providing sensuous pleasure as you stroke its rough surface. While looking at this slide, you see the name of Richard Rosenblum, who is giving rocks to many museums, or his family. He was an American sculptor who died in 2000, and in addition to his own artwork, he's remembered for having done more to inculcate a taste in the West for scholars' rocks than anyone else. His collection was superlative, and his generous family are helping major museums with their donations. Now, still, while you're looking at these three wonderful rocks, let me quote from the scholar Du Wan's book, Stone Compendium of Cloudy Forest, which was compiled just after 1125. He wrote in a way that helps us understand more about the power of rocks in the Chinese mind. His manual was written to describe his escapades in traveling around and collecting almost 150 examples of rocks. Du wrote, quote, "The purest essence of the energy of the heaven-earth world coalesces into rock. It emerges bearing soil. Its formations are wonderful and fantastic. Some rocks are carved with cavernous cliffs, revealing their interior, some with peaks and summits in sharp-edged layers." He continued, "Within the size of a fist can be assembled the beauty of 1,000 cliffs. Rocks can be large enough to be set up in courtyards or small enough to set upon a stand. Like gazing upon the peaks of Sung Mountain or facing the entire range of the Hmong Mountains, sitting quietly, your imagination is purified. The sage," here meaning Confucius, "once said," and this is Du Wan's words again, "the humane man loves mountains, and the love of stones has the same meaning. Thus longevity is achieved through that love." So here we find in the early 12th century so much about the power of rocks. The Western author John Hay has encapsulated Chinese writings about rocks by describing them as, quote, "kernels of energy and bones of earth, flowing with qi or vital energy, breath and spirit." He goes on to describe that the especially prized rocks, and this is John Hay sort of synthesizing all the existing Chinese literature about rocks, saying that especially prized are the stones that have been sculpted naturally by the processes of erosion, or at least appear to have been sculpted by natural erosion, and that they are a physical embodiment of the transformational process of nature. I should note that the Sung Mountain I just mentioned that Du Wan saw in one of his peaks, like perhaps the one in the middle, is one of the 5 sacred peaks of China, a mountain visited for ritual and worship. So scholars' rocks were associated in viewers' minds with very special places, religious mountains, and also they were associated with mythical islands believed to rise out of the Eastern Sea that were said to be the home to immortals. Rocks would bring a spiritual dimension into a garden or a home. You just can't get any closer to cosmic power than a rock. Now, when Du Wan, or any like-minded gentleman in traditional China, engaged with rocks, he thought of them as playthings. In fact, the Chinese literature actually uses the word plaything for rocks. This word is used for a range of movable decorative objects that were meant for contemplative and sensuous enjoyment and meant to be engaged with. So the rocks were not to be passively enjoyed, but you put effort into moving around them, touching, playing with them. So while envisioning a range of mountains in a rock, a scholar might visualize wafting mist and clouds among its rocky peaks, especially if he aided his vision by burning incense to watch a plume of smoke weave in and out of the stone's perforations. The miniature stone, remember, it's only about 3 inches tall, actually has a little cavity right here that's just the right size to insert a pellet of incense so that when you light it, that smoke comes up in and out surrounding the rock. We know from a textual record that a famous scholar, Su Shi, in the 11th century installed an incense burner in the cavity of a rock that he named Cave Paradise of Miniature Being, so that the smoke would seep into its hollows and emerge from its pitted cavities. We know that scholars often sat a rock on their desk next to an incense burner so they could recreate that feeling. Also, the custom of naming rocks was very common among scholars, and it's another indication of the psychological connection with rocks. Here I'm showing a painting that's from the early 14th century of a very famous scholar, and it allows you to envision something about bringing a small rock into a scholar's studio. You can see it right here and here in the detail. So it's put on the table to look like a mountain and give this very dignified scholar a source for all kinds of imaginative thoughts and contemplation, including, remember, that idea that rocks are associated with perfecting the spirit and immortality. Now here, I'm showing you a map, just if you want to know where the most beloved scholars' rocks come from. The 3 main areas are marked by stars. Here is a lake region called Lake Tai, and these are the very heavily pitted boulders. Then there's a region in Anhui province that's known for its Lingbi stones that are black, lightly textured, resonant when struck, and they're almost glossy and wet to look at. And the third area is down here in Guangdong, and it's the area for the Ying stones, which are a limestone known for its fine-grained, wrinkled, dimpled patterns. Now, again, looking at some favored rocks, let's talk about the criteria for connoisseurship. Already by the 7th, 8th, 9th century, 4 principal aesthetic criteria had been identified for judging scholars' rocks of all sizes. This is a little tiny one, and these are larger, and this is a full-size garden rock. The qualities of importance are thinness, openness, perforations, and wrinkling, shou, tou, lou, and zhou. In thinking about garden size rocks, the large ones, such as on the right, favored ones have a erect, thin stature, and they're especially prized if their silhouette has bulging curves that contrast solid areas with areas open to the sky. And perforations are important because they allow air and light to pierce the stone. They also appreciate the wrinkled surface of all of these rocks with grainy channels and cracks. You can imagine the enjoyment of seeing natural mist in a garden rock or incense smoke. In fact, sometimes even with the garden rocks, they would plant incense burners there to get the smoke. They also have written about in the literature the idea of sitting in front of a rock and watching raindrops collect in its hollows and drip down. So again, I want to just stress for you that rocks are interactive in how you appreciate them, and rocks are prized for being simultaneously weighty and slim, heavy and light, smooth and rugged. They're always being judged by having complementary qualities. Other qualities that were admired are things such as the overhang that you see here. Connoisseurs were delighted by an overhang like that because it makes the rock very precarious. It's so top heavy. You have to keep asking, is it going to topple over? Whenever you look at it, it seems about to fall, as if it's in a constant state of imminent forward motion. And yet simultaneously, it's just the opposite. It's steadfastly immobile. For the large garden rocks that seem about to fall, we have tales of 17th century writers talking about the exhilaration they felt by walking near a rock and the fear it would topple on them. Of course, all the while, they knew that a substantial amount of rock was deeply sunk into the ground as a safe counterweight. Besides these qualities, rocks were admired for looking like sacred mountains, but they also sometimes were singled out for their appearance to animals, birds, human figures, or mythical creatures. Do you see any animal here? Maybe here? Or perhaps in the little one, what I see is Henry Moore's sculpture, something that I'm sure the Chinese scholars would have appreciated. They want you to take time to think about connections to rocks. Now here, as an example of a rock that we know was pictured by its owner as an animal, I'm showing a painting that was recorded by a painting done by the Song Dynasty Emperor Huizong, who reigned from 1100 to 1126. In his calligraphy, he lets us know that this is one of his favorite garden rocks, and he calls it a dragon, saying that it represents his power to balance energy like a dragon has and benevolence. Dragons were always auspicious, bringing rain to agrarian China. Now, Huizong was a great artist as well as an emperor, so this is his own painting, and he was also a passionate rock collector and garden builder. So he built a huge garden in which this rock would have been shown, and he collected rocks from all corners of the empire. He wanted the rocks with these kinds of open crevices to resemble caves and attract immortals down to earth, so that when he would walk through his garden, the immortals would come and visit him and aid him in his own pursuit for immortality. Well, unfortunately, the emperor spent so much time with rocks that he neglected to deal with a border situation, and a foreign marauding army came in, met him in a garden instead of the immortals, and actually conquered his entire empire. For 150 years, China was divided, partially because of the emperor's petromania. But despite losing a kingdom because of petromania, the craze for rocks remained unabated throughout Chinese culture. About the same time that the emperor is collecting rocks, a famous scholar, the one just mentioned, Su Shi, refused to part with one of his favorite rocks for anything less than a trade for a painting that would be, in monetary terms, what the Mona Lisa is worth today. I told you, rocks were more important than the Hope Diamond. Now here I'm switching centuries, taking you up into the 18th century, looking again at the Qianlong Emperor's studio. He loved lithic art, and this studio is a very careful reconstruction using all 18th century materials that were collected by the emperor that the Palace Museum staff has arranged according to what records they have, the way they think the emperor would have had them. And what we see is that the educated man in China liked to combine natural scholars' rocks and worked jades. So notice the two prominently placed scholars' rocks. We have one here on the bookshelf that corresponds to this, and we have one here on the desk that corresponds to this, and we saw it earlier in a 14th century painting. So these are rocks for contemplation. Also, though, this rock being on the desk could be used for putting a painting brush. If you have an ink-filled brush, you can rest it on a rock as a brush rest while you're writing. So we have the use for contemplation and active use of rocks. And we also have jade. So coming back to that dual track of polished rocks and natural rocks, here we see a vase that resembles a Neolithic jade. but I can tell by the color of this that it's actually ceramic like this. So we already know in the 12th century, the Chinese were making porcelains to resemble ancient burial jades. And that's a sign of esteem for the jades. So it's been turned into a vase. But not only that use of jade, if you look at the wall decor here, all of these pictorial images, they're fashioned not by painting, but from jade. So the luminous, slightly three-dimensional stones that have been affixed to the background impart a commandingly luxurious appearance without being too showy to the objects in the emperor's studio. And again, they connect with all these feelings of jade as being magical. Just to show you another 18th century emperor. He took a Neolithic jade. You can see the cracks in it, just the way you see the cracks in this actual Neolithic jade. He put it in a wooden stand and made it a holder for his brushes or pens. So the scholars and the emperors were constantly reusing ancient polished jades. Now, here's another example of a wonderful jade that's in my museum collection. It's a Jade Pebble that belonged to the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century. It shows the intersection between polished worked jades and natural stones. The Jade Pebble was valued for its natural river eroded shape and its natural iron red staining. It follows aesthetic choices, not unlike those of choosing scholars' rocks for their color and their shape. On obtaining a new scholar's rock, collectors frequently composed a poem or essay about it, as we've seen. Here, the emperor did the same, composing an essay, and he turned the jade into a worked rock by having that carved into the surface of the rock. He goes on in this poem, letting us know that the rock was collected in 1762. He said that it came to him as tribute meant for the imperial collection, and he was impressed by the jade for the brilliant manifestation of a coxcomb red color and its shape like an axe. He called it beautiful and lustrous, naturally endowed with the elegance of heaven and earth. Its moist and blood-like appearance defy criticism. So you notice that reference to heaven and earth. Also, he put a seal at the end of the inscription, and that seal actually has the two Chinese words bi de, which mean literally compare to virtue. It's an allusion to a passage in one of the most influential ancient Chinese texts in China, the Book of Rites, in which it is written, "The gentleman compares virtue with jade." So I like this example because it's an intersection of work stone and natural stone. What you have in the Hillwood collection is much more heavily weighted to the highly polished, fully worked tradition. These two examples, the one on the right from the 17th century, the one on the left from the 18th century, are made out of a particularly beautiful kind of jade that the Chinese call mutton fat. You might not think that's such a compliment, but again, unctuous surface. Think of mutton fat. It's unctuous, slightly oily. It's so wonderful. And it's qualities of jade with this kind of purity that have led to a lot of idiomatic expressions in Chinese that compare people that are pure and noble to jade. There's an expression, clear as ice and clean as jade, to describe a noble person. Also, jade is used as a metaphor for beautiful women. The little cup on the right, it resembles the shape of an ancient bronze, giving it authority and recalling a golden past age. And it was used to hold water so that when you're grinding ink and you need water to dilute your ink, you can have a little on your desk. The one on the left, actually my favorite jade in the Hillwood collection, is just such unctuous jade. And the stone has been worked to resemble a fragrant citron, a plant that's known in China as Buddha's hand, because the fruit is naturally segmented into long finger-like sections, and the Buddha had long, delicate, and webbed fingers. The fruit is also associated in China with wishes for good fortune and longevity through rebuses or puns that can be made with the name of the rock. Now, just to kind of finish up, I want to take us to one more layer of complexity with the rock tradition in China. That is by illustrating how ubiquitous and broad-ranging the presence of rocks was and is today in Chinese art. Not only were rocks, actual rocks, viewed as art, but they also gave inspiration to other arts, including painting and porcelain. Here I am showing here on this side a rock of Ingstone from Guangdong province with sharp pinnacles, elongated piercings, and a deeply furrowed surface. This is the type of rock, the quality of rock that the Qianlong emperor in the 18th century so loved to collect. And because he was passionate about such rocks, he wanted them in other forms as well. So what you see on the right is actually glazed porcelain. He instructed his favorite kiln master to figure out a way to imitate a rock in porcelain. That tradition still goes on today. We can fast forward to the Chinese ceramic artist Zhao Meng, who teaches ceramic art at Harvard University. He creates porcelain rocks, responding to Taoist connections to nature's power of water, earth, wind, fire, and time, all of which are ever-changing, with one element transforming into another. This is how Zhao Meng views scholars' rocks, and also how he views the creative process he uses to recreate them. He works with wind-eroded earth or clay to add water in it, knead it together. When the texture is right, then he can actually shape and sculpt stones, which don't come to perfection until he fires them in the kiln. So all of nature's elements that are used to shape rocks are used, the same interplay of elements and ingredients is used to create his rocks in porcelain that rely on the unpredictable qualities of material and glazes and accidents of the kiln, just the same way nature uses accident to make any given rock. So like scholar stones, or the stones that specifically inspired Zhao Meng to make his sculptures, he wants his rocks to be objects of contemplation and meditation. And he wants them to give free rein to the beholder to imagine worlds within worlds, a favorite expression of the great rock collector Richard Rosenblum, who brought rocks to the American consciousness. Now, to quickly finish up again, painting and rocks has a very noble and long tradition. Especially by the time you get to the 17th century, Chinese scholars love to paint their garden estates. Here you see a real estate, you see a temple, here peeking behind it in the actual landscape. Here you see the temple painted. So they would often paint, and this artist actually, Song Maojin, has painted 50 views of his garden. So he starts with an overview. But then what's quite remarkable is most of those 50 views are individual one-page scenes, album leaves that depict the individual rocks in his garden, each one of which had been given a name. So with artists painting rocks, they had all kinds of ways to play around with that idea. Here, this artist, Sun Gehong, in the early 17th century, he paints a rock such as this one that he planted in a little garden with just grass around it. Here again, you see playing with a rock and the camellia flower. So I want you to again think of interaction with the actual rocks and with wanting to record them, to use the rocks to inspire painting. So now I want to bring us back to the contemporary times and contemporary painting. On the left, you see a wonderfully pitted, twisting, thrusting limestone boulder from Lake Tai, which, if you remember, is near Shanghai. The rock was taken to Beijing in the late 16th century and placed in a garden of a famous painter, Mi Wanzhong. We know that that artist's paintings were inspired by rocks such as this in his garden. The rock now is displayed in the courtyard of the Peking University Art Museum, where it caught the eye of one of China's premier contemporary ink painters, Liu Dan, who painted its portrait. Liu Dan has described rocks as stem cells or the DNA in the structure of Chinese landscape painting. They create the basic building block for depicting sacred mountains and embodying the spirit and life force of breath and vitality within them. He describes rocks as having hallucinogenic effects, which can transform one's sense of time and space. They enable the Chinese educated to create spiritual and physical spaces that correspond with aspired values. So Liu Dan spent as much attention painting the portrait of this rock as the best Western portrait painter would spend in capturing the visage of a notable person. Now, Liu Dan has a formal affinity for ink, its material form. He layers it intricately, painstakingly, majestically, studying the colors that can be teased out from it and using it to build the solid form of a rock, but with a medium in his hand that is so light, it's almost ethereal. He creates an oxymoron, a heavy, solid rock that floats. Liu Dan's objective is not to passively record a rock, but reinvent it, offering us views, details, and complexities that can only be derived from human imagination. He takes it to the point of installation art, putting an actual rock in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and painting 9 larger than life-size portraits of that rock. When we're in modern times, it's not just painting. Some artists, such as this artist, Jian Wang, his last name is Jian. He uses metal, stainless steel, to update the rock tradition. Jian's artificial rocks are made by hammering sheets of stainless steel onto the surface of an actual rock, and then removing it in pieces, pounding it flat, welding it together, and polishing it. Extremely laborious craftsmanship, and he creates a hollow sculpture. Again, something that's light that represents a heavy solid rock. He wants the stainless steel to reflect the colors of the surrounding environment. He is after what we've learned tonight is the importance of rocks. The fact that rocks are dynamic and in flux, and the surface of reflected steel creates unlimited variations through reflection. He's capturing the movement of rocks. He wants rocks to disappear in the environment, hovering between absence and presence by reflecting the environment in ever-changing views. So again, we have now a visual spectacle befitting the postmodern era that connects modern materials and Chinese scholars' rocks. As a conclusion, I end with a hope that we can all be spellbound by the transcultural, ahistorical power of rocks as art. Here I am recognizing that some of the best Western contemporary sculptors seem to have been mesmerized by pitted rocks as much as the Chinese were centuries before and still are. Barbara Hepworth's rock, it's called rock form sculpture, is an upright standing form with a narrow base widening out towards the top. The edges are curved and the form is punctuated by several curvilinear openings, the inner surfaces of which are smooth and hold a warm golden patina that contrasts with the green on the outside, which is rough. The sculpture reflects Hepworth, and Barbara Hepworth, I think, is one of the great sculptors. It reflects Hepworth's ongoing interest in the relationship between landscape and human experience. The artist took her inspiration not from Chinese rocks, but from rocks near Porthcurno, a hamlet close to Land's End in Cornwall. And she lauded that area for its queer caves pierced by the sea. Could almost be a Chinese description. She wrote, "Vitality is not a physical, organic attribute of sculpture. It is an inner spiritual life." Ah, but how much more true is this of Chinese scholars' rocks and the way jades are envisioned in Chinese culture. So I leave you with those thoughts about Chinese rocks. Thank you.
Jan, that was wonderful. I certainly count myself mesmerized by the extraordinary works and the grand tradition that you shared with us today. So thank you very much. I have a couple of questions from our audience already, but I'd like to invite all of our participants to share questions using the Q&A module, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Please, we have a little bit more time here with a wonderful scholar, and I'd love to keep her busy. And we've got 3 great questions to start off, but I do hope we'll get a few more. The first is Roberta Stevens asked whether there was a tradition of writing about rocks and how different people might see animals or other images from nature in the stones that they saw.
Yes, great question. There certainly is quite a large literature that began to mount up starting in the early 12th century and continued to grow. A lot of 16th, 17th century writers also wrote about rocks. And in judging and presenting what the aesthetic criteria are for judging rocks, several authors did talk about also seeing auspicious animals in rocks. So they do talk about seeing a tiger in a rock, a dragon in a rock, sometimes a bird in a rock. So yes, that was very much a part of the tradition. It seems to be that those rocks that look like a cave, a mountainous cave for the immortals, were the top quality rocks. But then it's almost as if they couldn't resist. It's kind of human nature to see things you recognize in rocks, and they did love that tradition.
Wonderful. We also have a question about where these rocks were sourced, whether they were mined, found as we saw them on the ground, how and where they came from.
So for the scholars' rocks, the main areas are Jiangsu province, Anhui province, and Guangdong province. So sort of like from the middle of China down south. Those are primarily limestone rocks. Now the Lake Tai rocks, for instance, they're actually dredged out of Lake Tai itself, which is a tidal lake. So the lake and the sand in it erode the limestone boulders. Originally, they were unworked boulders that were found, but then they became so popular that the lake couldn't supply enough. So people would actually they would start off by grinding holes part way and then plant the rocks into the lake to let nature finish course. Other of the scholars' rocks are mined. The Lingbi rocks that are black and glossy, they tend to come from caves that are found in Anhui province. So there are different ways of finding them in mountains, in finding them in caves, in rivers, in lakes. And also jade is often comes from river pebbles, like the red pebble we saw that was stained by iron that was in the water. That's a river pebble. There also can be found in mountains in boulders.
Wonderful, thank you. Catherine Finnegan asked whether the Celadon porcelain, and I think you spoke to this a little bit right after this question popped up, is if that is part of that larger tradition of designing porcelain to resemble precious jades.
Yes, I think absolutely. So it tells us something both about the esteem for jade and the esteem for porcelain, that these two materials that, at least in our mindset, would be on quite opposite sides of a divide, were in the Chinese mind brought together because they were both esteemed.
I love that particular connection and the idea of linking the two media.
Yeah.
Going back to the slide where you had the ceramic jade tube, is the figure on the right side an actual true scholar stone, or is it also made out of ceramic?
Oh, that was an actual stone.
Excellent. Mindy asked if any scholars' rocks have been lost or destroyed through cultural revolutions or other upset, whether there's a tradition of recognizing past scholars' stones, or whether these are things that are very carefully preserved and saved throughout large cultural changes.
By the collectors of rocks, there was always a very strong desire to preserve them. I mean, they name them, they write poems about them, they're valuable culturally and monetarily. So the idea with scholars' rocks is to pass it down to subsequent generations of your family. There are complicated stories in Chinese literature about rocks being so valued that one scholar in particular, he bargained with the devil, so to speak, and gave up 3 years of his life in order to keep a rock when somebody was trying to steal it from it. So he said to the devil, you give me my rock and I'll let you kill me 3 years earlier. So there are all kinds of passionate stories about it. So yes, the idea was to preserve them, pass them on. Now, what's happened in modern times is in the Cultural Revolution, so many things that were valued by the educated elite who had been trained and steeped in ways of the past were devalued. So certainly some rocks were lost, destroyed, thrown, broken. Some of the artificial mountains built up of rocks and gardens were kicked around. But there were so many other things to deal with in the Cultural Revolution that rocks didn't seem to attract the same ferocious attention of destroying them. Some of the gardens, the beautiful gardens, were used to billet the soldiers, the Red Guards. So they might have defiled them with dirt and trash, but they didn't ruin them. So in today's modern China, rocks are again very highly esteemed. So the gardens have been repaired and cleaned. People who now own rocks continue to own them, or sometimes they're given to museums. Chinese museum collections have rocks. The Metropolitan Museum has rocks. My museum has rocks. I think it's Hillwood's turn next. You can choose for inside or outside in the garden.
I love that. I love that. Lois asked whether people from all socioeconomic classes would have collected scholars' rocks, perhaps on different scales, or whether this is an endeavor that's primarily for the upper class.
The best we can tell, it's largely for the elite. But one of the problems that confronts us as historians is so little of the commoner's life is recorded. But I can say rocks must have had some importance, some presence in commoners' minds, because if we look at vernacular prints, such as the kind of prints that are always brought out and published quite cheaply around the New Year, we often will see a scholar's rocks depicted in some illustration, say an altar table to a god. So we know that commoners with little money were at least aware of this tradition, and they must have thought highly of it, but they well may not have had the money or the time to develop a collecting taste for them.
And our final question for this evening is whether there were particular stones beside jade that were highly prized in Chinese traditions. And I know I started by asking you when we were talking to highlight the jades. So
it's always been jade in the polished work tradition that is highly regarded. But because the word jade in China has a broad meaning and can include stones other than nephrite, they're always hard stones, but they're stones that can take a good shape and stones that can be polished to a lustrous surface. All those stones will be regarded, highly regarded. it is usually nephrite that is the highest, held to the highest level. And among the scholar's stones, the most prized stones all fall into the family, different types of limestone.
Jan, this has been absolutely delightful. And I'm so grateful that you were here tonight and shared these wonderful objects and wonderful stories with us. I am looking forward to my next visit to Hillwood to revisit our jades with a new understanding and a new light. And I'm so grateful for that. And I will say that I have many comments here in the chat from folks saying how much they've enjoyed being with you this evening. So
well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our participants, and I invite you to come visit Hillwood, see the jades, see the current special exhibition, or perhaps join us for an upcoming virtual program. We have events posted on our calendar, as Kate mentioned, at hillwoodmuseum.org, and we hope that we'll be with you again soon. Thank you very much.